Chapter 2. A Protonationalist View from the East. Beside his historiographic work, Graetz devoted much of his time in the last years of his life to the study of the Old Testament, which had in the meantime become the book of the Jewish national revival. He willingly accepted the principle of biblical philological critique, and even offered various suggestions as to when some of the late books were composed, but to his dying day continued to rebut any historical challenges to it. He was especially committed to the trustworthiness of the Pentateuch, and totally rejected the many attempts to date its composition to several different periods. For example, he regarded Spinoza's hypothesis that the Old Testament, or parts thereof, was written by Ezra to be idiotic. For Graetz, the Pentateuch was written not long after the events it described, and all that it recounted was historically accurate. The overwhelming proof was that the late prophets reiterated precisely the biblical stories written hundreds of years earlier. The idea that those stories could have been composed in that same late period did not even cross his mind. In 1882 the well-known biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen published his Prolegomena to the History of Israel, which became the most authoritative work of biblical commentary of its time. Wellhausen summarized and developed, by an ingenious and complex synthesis, a century of research that had attempted to date the composition of different parts of the ancient work. A brilliant philological analysis led him to doubt the historicity of some of the biblical stories and to conclude that certain key passages were written long after the events they described. As he saw it, the Jewish religion had developed in stages, and every layer in the Pentateuch indicated a different date of composition. Graetz launched a furious attack on this anti-Jewish work, and, as we shall see, almost all the Jewish nationalist historians would follow his example. He was especially incensed by Wellhausen's idea that the priestly codex, a major part of the Old Testament, was written after the return from the Babylonian exile. This meant that the narrative of the ancient history of the Jews was not the culture of a mighty and superb nation but that of a tiny sect, which he described as bloodless, that returned from Babylonia. This opened the way to challenge the veracity of the heroic stories about the origin of the Jewish nation. In the eyes of the first pre-nationalist Jewish historian, this exposed Wellhausen as an ignoramus motivated mainly by hatred for the Jews. He pours his hatred for the Jewish nose on Abraham, Moses and Ezra. For that matter, the well-known French philologist and historian Ernest Renan, author of the History of Israel, also came in for fierce criticism from Graetz, who regarded him as no less ignorant and anti-Semitic than his German colleague Wellhausen. As far as Graetz was concerned, a scholar who was not a Jew could not understand the unique significance of Jewish history. When Graetz died in 1891, Simon Dubnev, a native of Belorussia, who had been educated in a rabbinical school but was otherwise self-taught, published a moving obituary in his honor. The young Dubnev even undertook to translate into Russian the biblical chapters from Graetz's last work, Popular History of the Jews. Although published, this book had been condemned and destroyed by the Russian censors, because the Pravoslav Church viewed Graetz's would-be biblical national revisionism as an offense against sacred history. It was this labor of translation, as well as an early and enthusiastic reading of, oddly enough, the first volume of Renan's History of Israel, that prompted Dubnev to devote himself to the Jews and compose their history from the time they emerged from the desert to the modern era. It was no accident that Graetz's successor was a product of the Yiddish-speaking population of Eastern Europe rather than an academic historian in a prestigious, scholarly center in Berlin or Paris. Unlike the German Empire, the Russian Empire contained a vast Jewish population whose language differed from that of the majority. While the religion that had held it together for generations was weakening, it had a thriving secular culture of its own. Such a modernizing process had never taken place among the Jews of Central and Western Europe. The rise of nationalism in the surrounding societies, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish and others, in addition to the systemic discrimination in the Tsarist realm, worsened the situation of the growing Yiddishist community, whose more dynamic element was driven to migrate westward. The nationalist feelings that began to simmer in the remaining communities, especially after the wave of pogroms in the early 1880s, had no parallel in any contemporary Jewish community. There arose intellectuals and movements that were both pre-nationalist and nationalist, from the numerous supporters of autonomy to the handful of early Zionists, all searching for an independent collective expression with which to scale the walls of discrimination, exclusion and alienation presented by most of their neighbors. In this situation, it was not surprising that Graetz's book became popular, indirectly prompting another impressive enterprise, the invention of a collective national past. It was somewhat unexpected that the author of this literary project was an autonomist though not a supporter of a national state. Dubnow, like Graetz, devoted his entire life to the presentation of an unbroken narrative of Jewish existence in history. Like his predecessor, Dubnow may be defined as a pre-nationalist historian, yet not a Zionist. He did not believe it was possible, or appropriate, to transfer a large human mass to Palestine to build a state of its own there. But he did call for the creation of a fully autonomous space for the Jewish people, whose situation was anomalous. Most proponents of autonomy did not regard themselves as members of a race that was alien in Europe, and delineated their identity in keeping with the norms and mores of the lively, popular Yiddishist culture in which they lived. Dubnow was the exception. His pre-nationalist sensibility led him to look to the past in order to carve out a memory that would provide a firmer identity for a collective existence, which he feared had become too fragile and problematic. Dubnow's theoretical assumptions were a kind of synthesis between the Frenchman Renan and the Germans Herder and Fichte. From Renan he took the subjective elements in the definition of nationalism, will and consciousness setting the boundaries of the collective, and from Herder and Fichte he took a large dose of their swollen ethno-spiritual romanticism. Race, he thought, was just the first stage in the formation of a nation, which goes on to develop slowly and become a single cultural historical entity. But neither the race, nor the language, nor the territory determines the final shape of the nation in history. Nations are characterized as bearers of a long-term spiritual culture that reproduces itself and passes from generation to generation. But what was the secular superculture common to all the communities of the world people, Dubnow's term for the Jews? The Russian Jewish historian found it difficult to answer this question. Hence, despite his consistent secularism and his sharp criticism of the faith, he could not avoid pointing to the preservation of the Jewish religion as an essential condition for the secular national culture. The trend toward pragmatism, which later in Zionist historiography would make religious faith wholly instrumental in the definition of national identity, had found its first historian in Dubnow. But Dubnow felt uneasy about using a religious culture to define a modern nation, and this drove him to follow German Romanticism in search of a boundless and indefinable spirituality, beyond time and place, that rises like a mighty echo from an ancient source. As a subject of the vast Russian Empire, which could hardly become a nation-state, he never fully understood the role of the modern state in the creation of a national culture. Thus he could describe himself as an autonomist, leaning expressly on Herder's well-known populist essentialism. It should be kept in mind that the state is an outward social alliance, whose purpose is to secure the needs of its members, whereas the nation is an inward and natural association. The former, by its very nature, is accustomed to change, while the latter is fixed and unchanging. A nation that has lost its political liberty owing to a historical disaster should not also lose its national selfhood. For Dubnow as for Graetz, the nation-state was not the definite, immediate goal for the realization of a stable, secular Jewish identity. This longed-for identity existed beyond the concrete political reality and, for the time being, needed to be fostered and preserved. A look at the mosaic of Jewish cultures in modern times was misleading, and certainly could not provide a suitable answer to the definition of the Jews as a united spiritual nation. Hence the best way to preserve the nation's unchanging essence was to foster the consciousness that knew and recognized it, a consciousness that could be achieved by developing the study of history and expanding knowledge of the shared origin. For Dubnoff, in the absence of political sovereignty, the historian ought to replace the rabbi as the agent of memory and inherited identity. As a scholar, Dubnoff was less pugnacious than Graetz, because despite his romantic tendencies, he saw himself as a true man of science. At the end of the 19th century, on the threshold of the 20th, positivist science still held sway among European intellectuals, and so, in the transition from Graetz to Dubnoff, the writing of history as a sequence of novels was abandoned, at least in appearance, and the age of professional historiography began. Graetz had had no real connection to the European tradition of meticulous investigation of the past, which had developed since von Ranke, but this tradition left a clearer imprint on Dubnoff's work. Graetz had completely isolated the history of the Jews from their surroundings, while Dubnoff sought to connect it to the societies in which they lived. His books made effective use of the methodological tools that had been developed in the course of the 19th century in the various fields of historiography. Source references, supporting evidence, and cross-references had become standard elements of historical narrative. Dubnoff's World History of the Jewish People, the wide-ranging book that he began to write early in the new century, begins not with the ancient Hebrews but with a broad survey of the Near East based on recent archaeological discoveries. The findings at Tel El Amarna, the Elephantine Papyri, Hammurabi's Code of Laws, the Mesha Stela, all are cited to show that this was a scientific, or, as Dubnoff called it, sociological, work. He used the word sociological to indicate a study of the history of the Jews based not on their ideas, namely their religion, but on their existence as a living national body. The present living body was the totality of autonomous Jewish communities. Because of their common origin, together they constituted a single nation, rather than a scattering of religious communities, as Jost and his colleagues had thought. The national type had reached its finished form at the time of the first political downfall, Dubnoff asserted, and this would be his guiding motif throughout the work. The national body is present in Dubnoff's work from a very early stage. A secular rationalist, he could hardly adopt the whole of the book of Genesis as historical testimony, and he was aware that it had been written long after the events described therein. He therefore proposed to select those stories that seemed to conform more or less with reality, and to treat the others as metaphors, depicting the past in symbolic terms. For example, the story about Abraham the Hebrew symbolized the historical separation of the Hebrews from the nomadic Semites, and Isaac and Jacob represented the branching off of the people of Israel from the other Hebrew peoples. The biblical characters were collective prototypes. The events described, even if not exactly true, reflected real, large-scale processes. Dubnoff's narrative strategy would be adopted by all the Zionist historians who followed him, namely, that the Bible is indeed full of imaginary tales, but its historical core is trustworthy. Why? Because the legendary quality was added by later popular tradition and literary modification, which adapted the living people's memory that had been preserved, and which testified to a long and natural historical sequence. This embodiment of the people's memory constituted an authentic, indisputable testimony to the actual experiences of the nation. But when was the Old Testament actually written? It is most probable that the early events in the book were written in the time of David and Solomon, and their literary adaptation was done at the end of the Two Kingdoms, in about the 8th century, according to Dubnoff. The contradictions in the biblical text were entirely due to the fact that some parts were written by Judeans and others by Ephraimites. Dubnoff argued that Julius Wellhausen and other Bible critics were correct in their specific philological scientific analysis, and that some of the books of the Bible were indeed written in later periods, but that these extremist scholars overindulged in superfluous details, especially in their conclusions. Specifically, one ought to reject their basic premise that prohibits discussing in ancient Israelite culture predating the period of monarchy. The source of the general Oriental elements in Judaism is ancient Babylonia in the time of Hammurabi and the kings who succeeded him, who also ruled over Canaan, not the new Babylonia of Nebuchadnezzar and the Persian kings who succeeded him and likewise captured Judea. It is not possible to ignore the effect of the cultural environment of the Israeli tribes in the second millennium BCE, as do the school of Wellhausen and the proponents of the extreme Ezrate approach. Dubnoff, like Graetz and like all the prenationalist and nationalist historians in modern times, wanted to push the birth of the people as far back in time as possible, and insisted that the history of Israel began in the 20th century BCE. The similarity between the ancient Babylonian myths and laws and main elements in the Old Testament indicated the early chronology of the appearance of the children of Israel. Therefore the exodus from Egypt must have taken place in the 15th or 14th century BCE, because the defeat of Israel mentioned in an inscription on a stela ordered by the pharaoh Meneptah, discovered in 1896, proved that Israel was already present in Canaan at the end of the 13th century. This last finding was problematic for Dubnoff, and it illustrates the production process in his particular historiographic laboratory. He was well aware that at the assumed time of the Exodus and the subsequent conquest of Canaan, the pharaohs ruled over the entire region. How, then, could the enslaved children of Israel rise up against the Egyptian kingdom, abandon it by force, and conquer Canaan, which was part of the Egyptian domain, without Egypt intervening? Moreover, the Meneptah stela clearly states that, at that time, Israel was destroyed by Egypt and had no more seed, although there is no mention of this defeat in the Bible. Here is how Dubnoff resolves this conundrum. We must therefore assume that the hymn to the victorious pharaoh was inaccurate, and very likely the ruler of Egypt had to resist the rebellious peoples in Africa, or else this victory over Israel was in the desert, during the exodus from Egypt, when there was no trace left there of the seed of Israel. In any case, it is not possible that directly after the children of Israel settled in Canaan, they were attacked by the king of Egypt. To ascribe such a distant time to the Old Testament narrative required support from the new archaeological discoveries. It was necessary only to know how to interpret them so as to provide a scientific basis for the stories of the early Jewish people. Here Dubnoff initiated a lasting tradition in Jewish nationalism, which in later years would deploy digging implements to substantiate biblical stories, and with them, of course, the proprietary claim of the people of Israel to the land of Israel. At that time, archaeology, like historiography, was not yet Zionist, but already the Christian excavators took pains not to contradict the Old Testament, which might undermine the New Testament. What was a prenationalist or nationalist historian to do if a contradiction nevertheless emerged? In the creation of the national narrative, he would always prefer the truth of the theological text over the archaeological finding. Except for the scientific garb in which Dubnoff clothed his work, it remained wholly faithful to the Old Testament and, as in Graetz's work, simply eliminated the supernatural descriptions and the deity's direct interventions. The conquest of Canaan, the distribution of tribal lands, the period of the judges and that of the unified kingdom were given a detailed chronology and turned into modern history and sociology. The Jewish historian devoted separate, detailed chapters to David's great and Solomon's mighty kingdoms, because writing and literature were especially developed in the reigns of the two great monarchs, David and Solomon. They both had scribes and clerks who recorded everything that needed writing down in the administration of government, and certainly also wrote down all the events of their time. As for David's son and royal successor, Dubnoff had no doubt that the entire ancient world was aware of the personality of Solomon, who did the same as the kings of Egypt and Babylon, and built magnificent buildings and perpetuated his name in stone edifices. Dubnoff had not seen this magnificent architecture, but was apparently convinced that it would soon be discovered. However, at this stage of his work he was more concerned about the national predicament in which the ancient unified kingdom found itself following the traumatic split after the demise of Solomon. Dubnoff preferred to call the kingdom of Israel Ephraim to avoid confusion, because the biblical authors gave the name Israel to the entire people that came out of Egypt. He fully adopted the position of the ancient authors who demonized the secessionist northern kingdom, and even expressed some anger with it for building temples in addition to the ones in Judea. Despite this persistent sacrilege, he naturally preferred the kingdom of Ephraim, which was almost Jewish, over Edom, Ammon, and Moab, the other Canaanite powers in the region, though he quotes almost in full the stela inscription of Mesha, king of Moab. Summing up Ephraim's sad plight when it was destroyed and the Assyrian rulers settled it with foreign deportees, Dubnoff writes. And the Israelites who remained in their land mingled with the new settlers who had been exiled there, and lost their pure national type. Nevertheless, many of the Israelites retained their religion and nationality, moved to the southern kingdom of Judah, and joined the salvaged core of the nation. Following the Great Destruction, the forces began to concentrate in Judah, and this assured, amid the political upheavals in the east, the continued survival of the kingdom of Judah for nearly 150 years, and, later, of the Jewish nation. The later fall of Judah is painted in vivid, tragic colors, and the Russian Jewish historian's optimism is restored only by the return to Zion, although many of the exiles refused to return to their homeland from Babylonia. The building of the new temple in 516 BC strengthened the nation, though it still had to contend with a painful spiritual threat. Those who had remained in Judah after the fall had begun to mingle with their neighbors, and there was a growing number of mixed marriages. The Jewish scholar of the early 20th century was not a racist, but being concerned about continued national survival, he justified the biblical expulsion of the foreign wives as well as the outright prohibition on marrying them. These mixed marriages, customary alike among the humble and the great, jeopardized the purity of the race and the religion. The national culture of the Judahite people was not yet strong enough to absorb alien elements without their leaving a trace. During this period when it was constructing its habitation, it needed national isolation so as not to disappear among the nations, and so that Judaism would not become one of the numerous religious cults in the East, which lacked all universal value and were ultimately washed away in the deluge of history. Significantly, unlike Ezra and Nehemiah, Dubnoff's justification of procreative isolation was not religious but secular and modern. Treitschke's and Greitz's old Volkist anxiety filtered fairly easily into the early Jewish historiography pursued in Eastern Europe. The clear ethnocentric identity that underlay Dubnoff's historical discourse resembled other kinds of prenationalism and nationalism in contemporary Eastern Europe, Polish, Ukrainian, Latvian, and so on, but had a decisive advantage over them. It could go back to the 6th century BC for criteria to define the living national body. Like Greitz's first historiographic project, it, too, faced with antisemitism and rejection of the Jew, could lean on trustworthy biblical sources to explain and to justify an opposite and complementary reaction, a modern, secular Jewish national self-isolation.